Welcome back. In today's video, we're going to learn about combine. And we want to mainly focus on three things. We want to understand what combine is, why we need it, and how it plays along with SwiftUI. So without any further ado, let's get straight into it. So what is combine? Combine is Apple's framework for processing asynchronous events over time. Now for this, we have to understand what asynchronous events are. Well, almost everything in iOS programming can be considered asynchronous, starting with UI events where the user taps a button or some network request where you're waiting for some response from a server. Those are all events that happen over time. You do not know when you will get the response from a network request. Now, why do we even need combine and what are the advantages of using it? Well, it simplifies your asynchronous code. And more specifically, it means you do not have to worry about callback health. Now, what do I mean by callback health? Now, you do not have to understand this function, but what it basically tries to do is to perform a network request. And you can see it has a completion handler, which basically has to be called after the network request is done. So you can continue writing code that happens after the network request was successful or completed with a failure. Now it's really hard to understand what is happening in the body of this function because you have multiple completion handlers and you do not really know at what point which one of them is called, and it's obviously very painful to debug code like this. With combine, however, you do not have to worry about this anymore. It's really easy to express asynchronous data flows, and because of its declarative syntax, it's also very easy to read and maintain. Now, to understand how combine works, we have to understand the concepts of publishers and subscribers. Now, as the name suggests, the publisher publishes values and the subscriber subscribes or listens to these values. So let's start with the publisher. The publisher has an output type and a failure type. Now, in some cases, the publisher is very basic, so it just publishes an integer maybe and then completes. So in that case, it will never fail. So you could assign the failure type to be never, which would mean that it never fails. Now, the publisher also has a function called subscribe, which basically allows the subscriber to subscribe to it. However, it has some requirements for the subscriber. The publisher wants the subscriber's input equal to its output. So if the publisher publishes integers, the subscriber has to be able to take in integers as the input as well. Similarly, if the publisher never fails, then the subscriber's input type for the failure must be also never. Now let's have a look at the subscriber. As I mentioned, it has to have an input type and a failure type. But it also has some other functions. So initially, when the subscriber subscribes to a publisher, it receives a subscription, which is basically the first function. And after it got the subscription, it can receive values from it. And it will also receive whether it completed with a failure or successful. Now let's have a look at some basic examples of publishers. Let's start with the just publisher. The just publisher is a publisher that publishes a single value and immediately finishes. So right above we have three examples. So in the first one, we're publishing an integer, in this case 1. In the second one, we're publishing a string, and in the third one, we're publishing either a struct or a class called user. As I mentioned earlier, a publisher has its output type and failure type. Now with just, it's very obvious what the failure type is. It will never fail because it's really predictable what it's doing. It's just publishing these values and then it finishes. However, the output types will be different for each of them. So for the first one, it will be an integer. For the second one, a string. And for the third one, it will be the type of the struct or class. Now you can think of it as a flow or a data flow. And the way we usually describe these flows is using a marble diagram. Now let's have a closer look at a marble diagram for the just one publisher. So here you can see that the one is published, and immediately after it is published, we have this completion, which is basically indicated with this vertical line. Alright, now let's have a look at another publisher. In this case, I have the data task publisher, which comes out of the box from URL session. Now the data task publisher publishes data when the task completes, or it terminates if the task fails with an error. Now you can imagine in this case the failure type cannot be never, because obviously whenever you have a network request, it may fail. For example, if the server is not able to respond to your request. So in this case, the failure type per definition is URL error. And the output type is going to be a tuple of a data and a response. Now one more example. In this case, we have the timer publisher, and we basically initialize it by saying that it should publish every 1 second on the main queue using the default configuration. So what it does is it publishes repeatedly the current date on the given interval. So the output type here is a date, and the failure type here is never, because it's quite predictable what it's doing here. Now let's have a look at the marble diagram. So in this case, you will see we do not have a completion. However, we see a sequence of values where every second a new date is published. Now let's have an example of publishers in SwiftUI. Now in SwiftUI, you often have this observable object which has a published property. Now in this case, a random number which is of type integer. By adding this property wrapper @published in front of this integer variable, what we are basically doing is we're wrapping this variable and giving it additional capabilities. So in this case, this whole variable also becomes a publisher. And to access the actual publisher, you can use the dollar notation in front of it. So by saying $random number, you would be able to access its publisher. And you will see that it kind of looks like a just publisher, where the output type is an integer and the failure type is never. Now these are just some publishers. There are many other publishers. However, they all work very similar. As every other publisher, they must have an output type and a failure type, and they may complete immediately at some point of time or never. Alright, now let's have a look at some subscribers. The most basic subscriber is the key path assignment subscriber. Now in this example, we have the basic just publisher, which publishes the integer 9. And then we are subscribing to the publisher using the assign subscriber. Now in this case, we're taking what the publisher gives us, so the integer, and we try to assign it to the some number property on self. Now in this case, self is the view model we are in. And this will work fine. However, you will get an Xcode warning. And that is due to the way how Combine works. Now, whenever you have something like this, what happens is you have a flow from the publisher to the subscriber, and you're not really doing anything with the result. Now, one way to dismiss this warning that you get from Xcode is by simply adding this .cancel at the end, and Xcode will be just fine. However, the just publisher is very simple. In this case, it just publishes a value and immediately finishes. With more complex publishers, such as the timer or even network requests, you have to keep a reference to the subscription so it stays alive during runtime. But we will have an example of this later on. Now, another subscriber is the sync subscriber, and the sync subscriber basically allows you to do some more custom stuff. You do not have to directly assign it to a property. However, you can also do some modification to the value that you receive from the publisher. So you could add something to the value and then assign it to the some number property. However, in this case, I didn't do anything fancy with it. I did the same what the assign subscriber would have done as well. Now, we talked about the key path assignment as a subscriber and the syncs. However, there are more. There's also the subjects that are considered special because they are also somehow a publisher. Now, in general, when we talk about subjects, we distinguish between two types of subjects. There's the pass-through subject and the current value subject. And the best way to explain the difference between them is by an example. Now, assume we have this pass-through subject that has its output type defined as a string and the failure type defined as never. So this one will emit strings and never fail. Now in this case, I'm using the pass-through subject to send a string. And then you will see something new. You see this any cancelable. Now, remember I mentioned earlier that sometimes you have to keep the subscription alive. So in this case, you could use this pass-through subject to send values at any point in time. So it's not just like the just publisher where it publishes something and immediately finishes. However, this can happen at any time. So you have to keep it alive. And the way you do that is you define this any cancelable somewhere as a property outside of your function where you create your pass-through subject, and you have to make sure that it stays alive. So by assigning it to any cancelable, the pipeline basically stays alive to receive more values later on. So in this case, we're basically sending the hello through the pass-through subject, and then we're subscribing to it by using the sync, and we're simply printing the string. And after we subscribe to it, we send another word. However, with pass-through subject, you will only receive the word after you subscribe to it. So we subscribe to it after we send the hello, so we only read the output world. Now, if we wanted to read the previous value as well, we have to use the current value subject. Now, in this case, the current value subject is configured similarly with the output type string and the failure type never. However, you also have to give it the initial value because it also keeps track of the current value. Now, if I would subscribe to it and send a value afterwards, for example, world, you would see the output initial value and world. However, if you would send the hello in front of this subscription, so before we subscribe, we will also read out hello and world together. However, the initial value is lost. Now, subjects in general are quite handy because they allow injecting values into a stream, as you've seen in the example, but they can also be used to broadcast values to multiple subscribers. So you could have multiple subscribers listening to that one subject without any issues. Now, SwiftUI also uses subscribers heavily, and we will have a look at it later in our live demo as well. Now, there's one more concept we have to understand, and that is the concept of operators. Operators are between the publisher and subscribers. Now, to understand why we need operators, let's have a look at an example. Now, in this case, I'm using the just publisher that doesn't publish an integer but a string, but the string contains a 9. Now I'm trying to subscribe to it by using the assign, and I want to assign whatever the publisher gives me to the random number. However, this will lead to an issue because in this case, the subscriber wants to assign the output of the publisher to the integer variable random number. So the input type of the assign subscriber is an integer. However, the output type of the publisher 9 is a string. And there we have an incompatibility between the output type of the publisher and the input type of the subscriber. However, the failure types are fine. They are both never, so there is no issue there. But remember, in the protocol of the publisher, we said they can only work together if their value type and the failure type are the same. Now, to make them compatible, what we can do is we can use an operator. Now, in this case, I'm using the map operator, which basically takes whatever the publisher sends us. So in this case, it will be a string, and we cast it to an integer. And if that casting fails, we will simply map it to the 0 value. Now, by using this operator, we assure that there's compatibility between the publisher and subscriber, and the flow is not interrupted. All right, now enough of theory. Let's jump into Xcode and have some concrete examples. All right, open up Xcode and create a new project. Choose app, press next, give it a name. Make sure you don't name it combine. In general, don't name a project after a framework's name. So I will name this one testing combine. And make sure that you select the interface to be SwiftUI, lifecycle to SwiftUI app, and the language to Swift. Make sure you select the iPhone 11 as the simulator, and let me close this for now. All right. Now, by the end of this demo, we're going to build the following app. So here we have the timer publisher that basically publishes the time every second. And we will also use the data task publisher to load some names from a network request. So without any further ado, let's get straight to it. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is implement the view model. So I will say final class view model is going to be of type observable object. And inside of here, I will have a basic published variable called time, and it's going to contain an empty string in the beginning. And inside of the view, we are going to make use of this view model. So I will say at state object, it's going to be a variable called view model, and we will initialize it with the view model we just created. And instead of hello world, we're going to just render the view model dot time, like so. All right, so now we are ready to get started with Combine. Now, as always, make sure you put this into a separate file. So this would be into a group called view models. And in there, you would also import Combine, like so. Let me also separate this. All right, now when the view model is initialized for the first time, we want to set up our publishers. So the way we can do this is we can create a function called setup publishers. So I would say private func setup publishers. And I will just call this one inside of the initializer, like so. Now in here, I'm going to set up my timer publisher. So I will say timer.publish, and I want it to publish every second. So I will say 1, and it's going to run on the main run loop. So I will say main, and it's going to use the default run loop mode. Now, if we take a closer look at this publisher, you can see what the output type is. So as I mentioned before, it's the output type is date, and the failure type is never. However, there's also something special about the timer publisher. It has this function called connect that you have to call for it to start emitting these values. Now let's do that. Let's go back to our timer publisher, and right after we set it up, we are going to say auto connect, which automates the process of connecting or disconnecting from this connectable publisher. And then we can subscribe to it using sync. And inside of the sync, we will get a value, and we can simply set our time based on this value. Now the value is going to be of type date, but we are really interested in a string containing only the time. And to get the time, we will use a basic date formatter. And I already created one. And what it basically does is initializing a date formatter and telling it that we are interested in the time style. And it should be medium, so we can also see the seconds, not just the hours and minutes. And then inside of here, we can simply set the time as follows. We can say self.time is equal to self.formatter.string from date. And here we will pass in the value we get. However, notice that we're setting the time here, and the time is published, so it will at some point obviously also update the view. So we have to make sure that the view is updated on the main queue. And the way we say that in Combine is by telling the publisher that we want to receive on the main queue. So we say run loop.main. Now, the timer is one of these examples where we have to make sure that we keep the subscription alive. So what I will do is I will create another variable. It's going to be a private variable called any cancelable. And it's going to be of type any cancelable. And it's going to be optional. So initially, no. And then all I have to do is assign all of this to the any cancelable, like so. And Xcode should stop complaining. All right, now let's see if that works. So let's run this on the simulator. Now, as you can see, it works perfectly well. The view is updated every second because the publisher is publishing it every second, and we're setting it in the subscriber to the time variable which is published, and then the view is updated here as well. Now let's continue with the next publisher. Now for this, I will just put this into a different function. So I will create a new function called setup timer publisher, and I will put all of the code in here. and I will just call it in here. And then I will create a new function, which is going to be called setup data task publisher. And in here we will do the network request, where we will get a JSON, parse it, and show it in a list inside of our view. Now the JSON we are going to parse is going to be from the JSON placeholder API. So what we get is an array of objects, and we're mostly only interested in the names of each of these. So I will also put this URL into the description so you can try it yourself as well. All right, let's start by defining the URL. So I will say let URL be equal to an URL, which is going to be initialized with a string. And I will just pass in this API endpoint. And I can also force unwrap it because I'm pretty sure that this URL exists. Now to access the data task publisher, I will type URL session.shared.data task publisher, which takes in a URL. And I will pass in my URL in here like so. Now if we take a closer look at the data task publisher, you will see the same thing I already told you. You will see that the output type is this tuple here with data and a response. And the failure type is going to be of type URL or error. Now the data task publisher is a bit different from a timer in a sense that it can fail. So we have to also provide some error handling, and the way you can do that is by using, for example, try map. And when you do try map, you will get the data and the response. So we can say we take the data and response. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check if the HTTP response can be casted out of the response. So we try to cast it as a HTTP response. And if that is successful, we also want to check if it was a successful response. So we can look into the status code and check if it is a 200, which means successful. And if that is not the case, we're simply going to throw an error, and it's going to be an URL error. And it's going to be a bad server response error code. However, if the response was a success response, we just want to return the data. Now don't worry about any errors at this point because we're still not done. All we did till now is just create a publisher and added some error handling. At this point, we don't even have a subscriber yet. Now once we get through this try map, we will either get this URL error or this data. And we're mostly interested in the JSON format of this data. So we have to decode this data to a JSON, and we want to only have the names. So for this, we have to basically create a model first. So I will create a model up here. And I will call this one user. And we have to make sure that this one is decodable because we want to decode this out of the JSON that we get as a response. Now I am only interested in the name, so I will just declare a property for the name like so, and it's going to be of type string. However, it also has this ID which we can use to make the user identifiable, and that is super handy if we later decide to create a list in SwiftUI and iterate over them. So I will say it also conforms to identifiable, and it has an ID which is going to be of type integer. Now down here, after this try map, we're going to decode this data into a JSON, and it's pretty handy in Combine. The way you do this is you simply say decode, and then you tell it what you want to decode. Now if you take a look at the response again, you will see what we have is not just users, but we have an array of multiple users. So in this case, we have to say we're interested in the array of users, and by saying .self, we're telling it that we actually mean the type. Now we also have to provide this decoder. Now we know our response is going to be a JSON, so we can simply pass in the JSON decoder in here like so. And once we do that, we can already subscribe to it. However, similar to the timer, I want to make sure that I subscribe to it on the main queue. So the way I do it is I say receive on dispatch queue dot main, like so, and then I can subscribe to it using, for example, the sync. And here I will also get the receive completion, which I am not interested in right now. However, you can use it to see whether it was successful or not. And the receive value will give us the actual array of users. So I will simply take that array and set it to our users array, which we have to create. So let me create it quickly in here. So right after the published variable time, I will say published variable users. It's going to be an array of user and initially empty. And then I can simply assign it to it like so. And as previously, we have to somehow keep it alive. Now, the way we did it here was by assigning it to the any cancelable. Now, you could go ahead and create another one like these, but that can get quite messy really fast. There's a much nicer way you can do this, and that is by simply defining a set of it. So you can say private variable cancelables is going to be of type set of any cancelable and initially empty. And then we can go ahead and remove it here for the timer and simply say store into the set of cancelables that we have up here. So, and the way you do that is by using this end notation and typing the name of the set of cancelables. And the same thing you would do for the URL session as well. So I will do the following. And we can actually remove this now since we don't need this. Now lastly, I want to create a list. So let me put the text into a vertical stack like so. And right afterwards, I'm going to create a list. Just going to take the view model.users. And then for each of these user, I'm going to simply create a row. Just going to be a basic text view. And I want the name. Now let's run and see if this works. Now I have the timer running, but I don't see the data yet. And I think I know why that is the case, because we're setting up the publishers, but we're only setting up the timer publisher. We haven't set up the data task publisher. So let me call it in here as well and run it and see if that fixes our problem. And yeah, as you can see, we also were able to load the data from our network request. All right, now this is really all I wanted to show you in this tutorial. I hope this was useful and you got a better idea of how Combine works and how powerful it is. And make sure you subscribe to this channel so you get notified when new content arrives. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.